So it's it seems to have been they are made campus. I teach so it's not what it's so it's I know exactly. The only thing I worry is being a in my class now, you know, it's like right, yeah. Yeah. So your last grade, that is okay. Yeah, I missed that one. Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. You're getting rough to swing there. Questions? Welcome back to the statistics. We can talk on it's like exactly. We'll talk about the dinner. Okay, we're live. So just we can be a saddle. So yeah. Maybe. All right, people. Let's all shut up and we're gonna see the meeting and then Samantha.
Okay. Hello. Samantha Hunt is the author of The Unwritten Book, an investigation that explores our relationship with the dead, the dark stories, and 3 novels, Mr. Splitfoot, The Invention of Everything Else, and The Seas. Hunt is a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, as well as a long list of other things. She lives in upstate New York and teaches at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. Please join me in welcoming Samantha Hunt.
Hi, thank you. Thanks. Nice to see you all. I like that good Robert, New York City welcome. It's like, shut up. We're getting started. Thanks for having me. I'm going to read just for a tiny bit from an story called The Yellow. And the reason I'm going to do it is because it's the first time this has happened to me, but they're shooting it next week. Like it's going to be a little film. And it's the first time I ever did this too, but I helped to make it into a screenplay. And so I've been thinking about it a lot. And so I'm just going to read not the whole thing, just the beginning of part of it to you guys. Thanks. The Yellow. With his mother and father out of town for the weekend, Roy was left to forage for food in the nearly empty refrigerator. Was he physically or mentally unable to go grocery shopping, to order takeout from a restaurant? No, he wasn't. Roy nibbled on a raw onion and cheddar sandwich. The rattling house unnerved him, and the sandwich was too strong. It was an angry sandwich. What made a house rattle? He couldn't say. He felt exposed in the kitchen. He abandoned his meal on the countertop and switched on the living room TV. He sat through the evening sitcoms, the late news, the late shows, and the start of a movie he'd not seen since 1985, telling himself that the noises he heard were wires scraping the siding in the wind, even if they weren't. At 42, he was living in his parents' home again, eating their food, driving their car from job interview to job interview. Nearly 2 in the morning, sick from so much TV, Roy riled himself into a fury of self-improvement. He spent the early morning hours in his bedroom, tearing down handmade Beavis Frond posters and a paper chain that he'd fashioned from gum wrappers. He moved all of the furniture except his bed and dresser up to the attic. In the basement, Roy found a half-full can of paint his father used to mark the curb out front as a no parking zone. Roy carefully began to paint his walls. He went without sleep. What was sleep to him? And by 11 the next morning, his work was done. He sat cross-legged on the floor, inhaling heady fumes. Yellow was everywhere, yellow and calm. Fear and confusion had left. Possibility and sunshine became his friends. In the yellow, he felt himself the newborn child of Patti Smith and Jacques Cousteau. Roy rolled a cigarette and visualized foreign, gentler lands, India, Morocco, Florida. Eventually, Sunday evening, his parents returned. His father, registering the new color of the walls, asked, "Son, did you turn faggot over the weekend?" Roy offered no comeback. He held on to the color. He picked a flake of tobacco from his tongue and admired his father's use of the verb turn. Turn was precisely what Roy had done after 3 days of ripening in silence. He'd turned, he'd fermented into something wonderful and open, something porous and bright yellow. Suzanne's turning, on the other hand, had been far more subtle. Perhaps she didn't even realize she had turned, or maybe turning comes easier to women acclimated as they are to miracles and pregnancies, of which, by the age of 39, she'd had 3. Roy walked out on his father without answering. He grabbed the car keys from the kitchen table. He drove, and while he drove, he tangled with the scan button on the car radio. He drove open, porous, and yellow, his tires floating above the asphalt. He drove threading together seams and streets, all his ideas, until quite suddenly the night became rigid. In one moment, there was nothing, no music, no thoughts, just a pure electric shock of adrenaline. Something black and furry had darted out into the road, frozen in Roy's headlights and tumbled out of view. Squeals, brakes, and wrong-sounding mechanical thumpings followed. He had hit a dog. Roy had hit someone's dog. Pulling off onto the soft shoulder, he felt a certain resistance from the undercarriage. The vehicle and the animal had been joined in a terrible union. He sat without moving. Perhaps it wasn't a dog. Perhaps it was some other creature, a beast unnamed and unknown, part woman, part deer. The thought gave him pause. He sat, not long, but long enough to know that the thing was truly dead. There'd be no watching it limp away into the dark night, no gnashing teeth. He would not have to back the car up and over the creature. He would not have to kill it a second time. Eventually, Roy got out, and the night stayed silent. He circled the vehicle 2, 3 times. There was nothing to be seen. Overhead, black branches cut their silhouettes on the navy sky. Roy crouched, and there it was. Just a dog. Simple. Its body had been wedged behind a back wheel. Roy grabbed its tail and yanked the broken thing out from under. Something tore like fabric. The neck was soft and floppy, like a harshly used work shirt. The dog was dead, for certain. Roy hoisted the animal into his arms and set out for the nearest driveway. He could see it up ahead. An outdoor floodlight spilled onto the road in a narrow swath, most of the light getting trapped in the yard by a line of tall maples. The dog's body, not yet cold, warmed Roy and kept his arms from shaking. Roy rang the bell, but Suzanne was vacuuming. He carried the dog around to the side door. Front doors are for holidays. The dog's brown eyes caught the light. It was no holiday. As Roy waited on the stoop, Suzanne, with a vacuum hose in hand, her exhausted life came into view. His knocking grew more desperate. He couldn't very well leave the carcass on her doorstep. He'd be forced to carry the dog from house to house until he found someone either heartbroken or intrepid enough to claim it. She started when she saw Roy. It wasn't a busy street, but the sort where too much wealth kept neighbors from dropping by unannounced. Earlier, Suzanne's husband had detected a certain ticking in her. He packed their children into the car for a night of pizza and a double feature at the second-run movie theater, leaving her alone to explode, to splatter the house with a combination of things she'd ingested as a teenager, films and punk rock records that confirmed what she'd guessed back then. One dies alone. Best to have her family out of the way. Best to have them hidden in the dark cinema when the desire surged to chop her hair roughly and live on cigarettes. These bursts of freedom, while infrequent, were dangerous. Their self-indulgence could tear holes in evenings, marriages, families. She'd been lost in the roar of the vacuum, a device that had the power to put her under a spell, so she could contemplate the nature of the universe, the purpose of love, the purpose of death, and a fantasy she sometimes had of being bound, nude, to a parking meter in the city. It was in this trance-like state that she saw Roy. What was he holding? She shut off her vacuum by yanking the plug from the wall. She opened the door. Hello? Hello. I'm afraid I've killed someone's dog. Yes, she confirmed, that's Curtains. He belongs to my children. Curtains? It's an old story. And then looking at the animal again, oh dear. She reached out and took the dog's body from Roy. And for a moment, like an uninspired actor in the uninspired film her husband and children were just then watching, she brushed the skin of Roy's forearm. She held his eyes, trying to remember if they'd met before. Poor Curtains. They had never met. Oh, Roy said, oh no, I am so sorry. When nervous, he adopted an inflection that was not his own. His voice ratcheted up into a phony British accent, as if British accents were so appropriate, so authoritative that they could make any American dog be not dead. I'm dreadfully sorry. There it was, London, England, done very poorly. Roy hoped that maybe she wanted the dog dead for some reason. Maybe she'd grown tired of feeding him or accidentally petting those hard body lumps that old dogs get. I'm sorry. Roy tucked his chin in shame. He came out of nowhere. I didn't even have a chance to break. I'm sorry. Let me give you some money for a new dog. He reached for his wallet. He was broke. What does a dog cost? There were $16 in his wallet. $250, Suzanne said. She carried the dog into the living room for a mutt. Oh. He fumbled and followed her. $250 seemed like robbery. Can I write you a check? He had $267 in his bank account. If he wanted to, he could go to an ATM tonight and withdraw it all before she could cash his check. Suzanne covered Curtains with an afghan that had been draped across the couch. She crouched in front of the dog, shielding him from Roy. What a thing for her dog to do, run out in front of a stranger's car and open himself up. What desperation. Curtains should have come to her, Suzanne thought foolishly. Don't go to strangers, Curtains. There was blood on Roy's jacket, blood on her arm, in her hair, Curtains' insides made pornographically public. Death really was mortifying. A check is fine. Make it out to Suzanne Martin. Suzanne Martin, certainly. He found a seat and began to write. One surprisingly rigid paw stuck out from beneath the blanket. She knew the paw well, dipped in white fur, claws that alternated black ivory, a piano on her dog's foot. She felt the dog lose its heat. She felt his body go cold. As Suzanne bent to hold his paw to her cheek, Roy saw that she loved the dog, and he knew he would not go to the ATM. He joined her on the floor, wrapping a stiff arm around her shoulders. He stowed the check away in his jacket pocket. Shh, there now. Roy and Suzanne sat by the rigid dog. She whimpered. She sounded like a tiny door creaking open. She wept and sniffled, Roy steadied the wall's molding, the wall itself, a trace of dust along the molding's shaped ridge and electrical outlet. What had he been thinking before the accident? He tapped his free hand against his temple and drew a blank. Underneath his hand, her shoulder felt cushioned in a way that his wasn't. There was her skin, there was her muscle, there was her bone, her blood, and all the blood's attendant particles keeping her alive, particles whose names he'd never know. They were strangers except for this dead dog. He thought of the yellow and turned towards Suzanne, locating her lips with his own, some way of knowing her. Suzanne did not react, and after a few slow moments with his mouth resting motionless on hers, he inserted a pointed tongue. She accepted it. Roy and Suzanne lay back on the rug beside the dog's carcass, beside the coffee table. Beneath the burned odor left by the vacuum, he could smell the dust still in the rug, salt and sand and dried skin from her kids, her husband, her now dead dog. Roy inhaled, and they stayed there, locked in a silent trade. It wasn't a kiss exactly, but something equally spectacular. The night, for all the species of insects alive in it, barely noticed. Eventually, time passed, and he buried his fingers in the hair at the nape of her neck. He pulled her closer. His other arm found the small of her back and used this handle to unlock some ancient pattern. Their bodies began to move. My dog died for this bit of living, Suzanne thought. She did not consider her husband. She brokered no possible connection between her husband and lying on the floor with a stranger. Roy's hands moved to unfasten, unhook, undress their bodies, conducting an urgent experiment. His face was still damp. Her face was still damp from crying. In the shock of this unexpected coupling, he pinned her to the floor, and she was a bird. He found his way inside, and Suzanne filled the room with sound, incantations that started with the routine, oh yes, God yes, and morphed into the unfamiliar, take it all, before winding up at the truly unnatural, paint your landscape, storm, storm. Not sexy, just peculiar. Pleasure remained a far-off cousin to whatever exchange they were having. At last, his muscles and eyes trembled. A transfer was completed. The charge between them dimmed. A film of sweat developed, some guilt, some old wonder. Both Roy and Suzanne began to chill. He didn't look at her. He was unsure what he had got in the trade, though he knew it wasn't inconsequential. Good for him. I should remove myself, he thought, and was about to, when he felt something rough and warm, damp and thick. Curtains was licking the sweat from his scapula. With a scream, both naked man and naked woman recoiled. He rolled boot camp style, a protected ball, into the shelter of the baby grand. From there, he eyed the dog with dread. Suzanne jumped to her feet and up onto the frantic couch. Curtains had come back from the dead. The dog raised his brow, wondering why these humans should act so foolishly. Suzanne lifted her hands in surrender. The dog was dead. The dog was dead, Roy confirmed, and it was true. They'd seen it and felt it. The dog, moments ago, had been ruined, limped, no more. How, Suze? Their physical intimacy had shaved away the Anne of her name. He cradled and rocked himself, a squatting troll, a head, a rounded back, and 2 feet sticking out from his torso. He looked grotesque underneath the piano. Curtains licked the thin, pale fur between his legs. My dog is alive. But why? Why is your dog alive? Suzanne scratched her left buttocks. You must have only knocked Curtains unconscious. Roy looked from the dog to Suzanne. Then how come you don't want to touch him either? Nonsense, Suzanne said, readjusting her position of retreat. Come here, boy. Here, Curtains. The dog looked up from his lick and made his way over to the waiting hand. Suzanne held her arm out as far from her body as possible. Curtains rubbed against it, and Suzanne immediately snapped her hand to her chest as if burned. She covered herself with a fleece blanket. Back, she told the confused dog, back. Curtains, as dumb and happy as any non-dead dog, cocked his head and studied the hunkering humans before meandering into the kitchen to see if, in the time he'd been dead, someone had refilled his dish with kibble. Quickly, Roy crawled out from underneath the piano. What should we do? Suzanne nodded. She stood, distancing herself from him. They were not a we. She dressed swiftly, nodding. She tightened a belt around her sweater. So, she said, looking into the kitchen where Curtains had gone, you'll have to kill it again. Roy drew his eyes wide and wider. What? It? We've opened some sort of door here. She knelt in front of Roy, resting her hands on his knees as if they really were lovers. It can't stay open. I have a good life. She pinched the meat of Roy's thighs. You'll have to kill the dead dog. I'm going to stop there. That's not the end, but I'll stop there. Thanks. I hope you all weren't sitting there thinking I was going to let the dog be dead. I always hate that in the beginning. I'm like, they think I killed a dog. Oh, we go over here now? Okay.
All right, ready? Well, immediately, my first question is all about the turning it into a film and the screenplay. That's not on my list, but you threw me a curveball. So no, I'd love to hear about that.
I was just approached by a young screenwriter and a director who they wanted to adapt it. And, you know, I had never really thought about that. I always work pretty much all alone. And it was exciting to me. It was during the pandemic that they approached me. And so it was actually really exciting to think about writing with other humans. I never write with other humans. And so, you know, we just met on Zoom and did it that way. And it was kind of wonderful for me. I have to say, like, it didn't seem that hard. I think that when I'm writing in the first place, I'm already translating from a visual world that I'm seeing. And so it felt easy to turn it into film. You know, it's like a lot of dialogue. There's not a lot of like, oh, Suzanne felt this or thought this. And so it kind of went easily to screenwriting for me. And plus it was fun to work. They're both in their 20s, the women I'm doing it with. And it was fun for me because I'm 50 and, you know, just to have that different point of view was really quite fun.
So did you say it has been filmed or it's filming now, or what?
Next week is when they start. Yeah, they're non-SAG people, so they're allowed to make it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm gonna go to my original questions. I'm gonna start with, you know, so we're all in an MFA program, or most of us starting off as writing. So I'm just curious how you came to writing and how it was writing your first novel.
Sure. I mean, I probably like all of you guys, I wrote all in high school, and I wrote really, really very badly in high school. Terrible things. Like I look at it now and, oh, wow. And I wrote then in college, still really terrible. And I graduated, and a friend of mine had free rent in LA, moved out to LA with him, and continued to write really terribly, just like Fitzgerald ripoffs, you know, like I was like setting everything in like 1929. And I was like, I don't know why. I just thought that was how you wrote a short story. And I went to a graduate program. I got my MFA, and while I was there, I was writing fiction, but I was hanging out with the poets a lot. And, really started thinking about slowing down language and studying poetry and how that could help my fiction so much. And so learned a lot from the poets. And my first book is called The Seas. And right as I graduated my MFA, I knew I had to start a project pretty quickly. Those of you who are graduating this year, it's good to leave with a project kind of like in your mind that you want to start working on, because sometimes when you suddenly don't have somebody telling you it's due that day. Although also your cohort can kind of be that too when you graduate, right? To have people give you deadlines and things like that. But I started writing The Seas immediately afterwards. And something else about that book that can be helpful for those of you guys writing a first novel is I wrote that book in 250 really, really short pieces. I had a full-time day job and had to get the writing done in the interstitial hours. I would wake up at like 4 or 5 in the morning because my job started at 7. And so go, write these short pieces. And when I had about 250 of them, they kind of felt like bricks, and I just put them on the floor, and I felt like I was building a wall. Then I just was putting mortar between the pieces. And it was really like a very manageable way to think about writing. It's funny for me because now when I look at that book, like I still feel like the bricks are interchangeable, like you could move them around, but I guess maybe other people don't feel that way, like the people who published it. They did. It was out of print for a while, and it just came back into print from another press. And at that time, I remember I was like, can we just like move these things around? And they were like, no, what? You can't do that, So I didn't, but I did change it a little bit the second time around. So yeah, that's what I would say for starting out.
Well, and The Seas is about a girl who believes that she's a mermaid. So there's that sort of like sense of like reality or like belief or what's real. And I feel like the interchanging sections probably really affect like how you read what's real and what's not.
It's
right?
So true. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when you arrive to the end of that book, it's kind of like you as a reader. This might drive some of you crazy, but it's a little bit like you as the reader. Either you're a pessimist or an optimist, basically. I mean, I know what I think happened at the end of that book, but I guess other people think different things happened at the end of that book. And there's a way that I feel like, hopefully both are possible in some, multiverse, in the multiverse we live in, this very one and that one too. Yeah, so it might change the outcome if you shifted it too much, I guess. Yeah.
Has that approach, the bricks, been your the way that you've built your other novels, or has your approach changed?
I think it pretty much changes with each book. The one after that was one set right here in this neighborhood at the Hotel New Yorker. It's about Nikola Tesla, and that was very historical approach, although I have to say that the details of that man's life were so unusual that while I didn't make up things about his biography in that book, I actually had to remove things because I thought nobody will believe how strange his life was. They'll be like, oh God, why is she telling these lies about this poor man, who is already forgotten? And yeah, this was before Elon Musk named the car that. So he really did feel forgotten when that book came out. So that book is really just research driven and written in that way. I did have, I had to kind of create a fictional character in that book too, to play Tesla off, because he was a hard person for me to access. He never recorded his voice, despite the fact that he invented radio. He never recorded his voice. So I didn't have much of a sense of him. He was very reluctant to be around people. He had horrible germ phobia. I mean, he's basically the polar opposite of me. I love germs. I love them. And I also love people. And so it was really hard for me to access him. So I did have to create this fictional person to bounce him off of. But that was a totally different experience of doing a lot of research. The book after that, I was like, that's Mr. Splitfoot. I was like, yeah, I'm going to write a thriller. It's so not a thriller. Well, maybe, I don't know. My sister gets scared when she reads it, but she might be the only person in the world. And that book was constructed, I thought of it as two different books. It's an argument of whether you believe in things or not. And I both believe in things and don't believe in things. And so I wanted to be able to argue both sides. So I wrote two books. And I thought of them going back to back, like you'd have to flip the book over to read it, because things are kind of revealed in that book. Both narratives climb up a mountain. And I was like, oh, I love that idea that they'd meet in the middle and you'd understand things would be solved there. But that's not how it got published. It got published alternating chapters. And so that idea of like the tyranny of the start in the middle and the end, that annoys me about book publishing. But so that one was really quite different because I was trying to write a thriller. I was really like, plot, I have to think about plot. And I was doing a lot of mapping for that one. The book after that was The Dark Dark, that I wrote alongside at that same time. And it's a collection of stories. So I guess you could think of that as bricks. I mean, I guess any story collection is collected in that way of, whatever the topic is. What I think The Dark Dark is kind of like that good feeling that you have at night when you're looking out into the darkness and you, instead of being scared, you're like, I got to get out there. You're like, ooh, that it's a wonderful sense of like curiosity or question. And then my latest book is actually a piece of nonfiction, and that one is collected very differently. It's about our relationship with the dead primarily, and each different essay investigates different ways in which we get haunted. And I think of hauntings not just our dead necessarily. I mean, anything can haunt you, like a pop song can haunt you. They often do. And so it's investigations into all the things that we carry in our body that maybe we want, maybe we don't want to have with us. And in the heart of that book are 3 chapters from a novel that my dad wrote that I found in his desk drawer 3 days after he died, about people who can fly without wings. And, and that was really like where that book started, because I thought, oh my God, I was like, Dad, could you fly without wings? And you're dead. And now I can't ask you that. And so just, coming up against that finality of death and that problem of not being able to ask him. So they're all assembled, I guess. Yeah. Sorry, that was such a long answer to your question.
That's fine. It's
And
very complete answer. So thank you.
Okay.
I'm going to go back to Nikola Tesla.
Yeah.
Because you said he was hard for you to access. Probably you mean like in research. But my question is just, why Nikola Tesla? Like, how did you come to him just even on as an idea?
Okay, this is crazy. How I came to him. I had gone to an exhibit at SUNY Purchase, the museum there in the Newburger, great museum. And one of the exhibits was about Cinema Volta, which was a movie theater. I think it was in Trieste that James Joyce started. And he, for a very short time, ran a movie theater called Cinema Volta. And I thought, oh, Alessandro Volt, I was like, I guess I know some things about Alessandro Volt. Had to just, he had something to do with electricity. I was like, but I should look up more about him. And I thought, okay, I better look up more when I get home. And this was like before smartphones. So I had to actually return to my computer to get more information. And when I got home, I took the train back to the city. And then by the time I got here, I had messed up Volta with Tesla. So his name must have been kicking around in my head somewhere.
Oh.
I can't tell you where. There was like a hair metal band called Tesla. I don't know if that's how it was in my head, but he wasn't a man taught to me in school ever. I mean, I was taught Edison, but I was never taught Tesla. And of course, now we all know that Tesla is the real hero. All this electricity that we're enjoying right now is all AC electricity. That's all Tesla. And so when I started looking him up and started doing the research about him, one of the first thing I was like, okay, he invented radio. Didn't know that. Thought it was Marconi. I was like, oh, he invented electricity. Didn't know that. Thought that that was, Edison is always given credit for that, although he didn't really invent anything, except marketing. And the third thing that I learned was that when he was a boy, he made a motor that was powered by June bugs, which is really pretty mean, but also amazing. And I was like, this is an interesting fellow. He had plans to photograph thought, like just the most surface research that I did on him. I was like, what a magic person. And I was so upset that I had never been taught him in school that I thought, oh, I better, write a book about him. So that's how that started, totally by accident.
I love that. That's so interesting. And even though you couldn't find things in his voice, you wrote in first person about him. So what are your thoughts on that? And how did you come to that decision?
It was not a natural voice for me. It was actually really hard. But I tried it in third person, and it seemed also, he's already such a distant character that it felt so removed and it felt really cold. The way that I finally got any access to him at all was he did have some friends, and he had some really amazing friends, like John Muir was his friend and Mark Twain was his friend. And he and Mark Twain had such a really beautiful relationship that when Tesla was older and his thoughts were kind of getting crumbly when he was living at the hotel right here, Mark Twain was long dead, and Tesla kept trying to send him some money, and he had a delivery boy bring this like $500 down to Mark Twain's old address, and it was an address that didn't even exist anymore. It was when there was a South Park Avenue, and the delivery boy kept coming back and being like, this person's not alive anymore. Samuel Clemens is not alive. And I thought, oh my God, that love that transcends the grave, that he was still trying to take care of his friend at that time, because Twain had taken care of him too. And so the idea that he loved his friends was kind of how I could access him. I was like, okay, I love my friends too. And so I tried to make this first person voice. I can never listen to the audiobook because the woman who does his voice uses an accent, which I know they do that in audiobooks, but I was like, oh, like this kind of general Slavic accent. I thought, oh, okay. Can't listen to it. Not that I would want to listen to my own book, but.
Well, the invention of everything else takes place in New York City, and it's very much, there's a lot of description of the city and what the city used to be in the seas, obviously by the sea. And even in Mr. Splitfoot, they're walking through New York State. And I feel like in all three of those, the sense of setting is very integral to what you're talking about in sort of like a subtle way. Yeah. So I wondered if you are very intentional with setting, or if it sort of comes out in the work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's part of the idea of haunting that I think all of my work works with, is like how the land that you inhabit haunts you. Especially here in the city, there's always a feeling of everybody who's been here before us. Like, at least when I was living here, like my apartments would have like 18 layers of paint on them, like the landlord just slapping on some new paint, and you'd be like, what family lived here under that kind of paint, or what family? And so the idea of the place affecting our day-to-day reality, I do feel that everywhere. I'm also just, I'm I'm a nature nut too, and I'm oftentimes outside and in the woods, and so thinking about how the landscape affects us is pretty integral to all of the work that I do. The research that I did on Tesla was so much fun. It's so easy to do historical research on New York City. There's resources everywhere, right? And I got to work at the New York Public Library, and I got to work with the historian at the hotel. That hotel is wow, what a history is there. It's kind of incredible. I'm sorry, we probably don't have enough time, but I have to tell you something crazy story that happened while I was doing the research. He would take me into all the tunnels that were closed off. There's that hotel, what's open to the public now is 10%. It's huge. It was the biggest hotel in New York City when it opened. And he was like taking me in all these tunnels. I was also like 8 months pregnant while this was happening. I had a hard hat on, and we were underneath the tunnel, you know, and you can get to Penn Station from there and blah, 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 all this stuff. And we come up into this ballroom, this former ballroom that's completely abandoned. And there were like all these aliens and weird things flying around. And there was Will Smith, and they were shooting some movie in there. And there was like all this special effects. And I was like, whoa. But they were screaming at us because I was like this hard hat pregnant lady with my Mooney guide, you know, because it's also owned by the Mooney Church. Yeah, it's an interesting history there. Sorry, that has nothing to do with writing.
But it's an interesting story. So back to writing. In The Dark Dark, you start the collection with the story of and end with the story of, which I believe in the Unwritten Book, you mentioned like it was just two different offshoots of revision.
Yeah.
But it's so much both about duplication and division that it seems like thematic. So
yeah. So that whole story is about procreation by division and like a woman who can't get pregnant, and she's becoming obsessed with this idea of getting a baby, and she goes through probably some unsavory roots, like, you know, some sort of creepy ways. And so bad things start happening. And the narrative at the end of the book, the story of it really starts replicating itself again and again, almost like you get trapped in that story. It starts to replicate itself. But it is partly because I revised that story so many times, and I basically had 30 versions that when I went to put the story collection together, I was like, well, which one am I going to choose? And there was one that was more traditional, the story of, and then there was one that was like as far out weirdness that was possible, and that's the story of. And so I was like, I'm going to bookend the book with both of those things, because I appreciate revision. It's totally how I work. It's like 95% of what I do is revising stories. And so I was happy to kind of have both of those stories in there. And I had also had a really creepy experience once of reading a Kelly Link book that the story started repeating itself, and it really frightened me. It was such a terrifying experience. It turns out it was just a printer's error. Like they had put two, but I had already had the experience, and I was like, that's the scariest thing that could happen with the book, is if the book starts over again and you feel like, oh my God, I'm never going to get out of this book. I'm trapped here now forever. And so when you start reading the story of, it's exactly the same as the story of. And so my hope is that a reader will be like, I already know this story. What's going on? You know, I had to kind of change it up pretty quickly because I was scared that you'd also be like, I'm not going to read the same story I just wrote, but then it starts to shift. And so I also like what that says about genetics too. And when we, you know, like how genetics can shift slightly, like you can see, I see your father in you, but slightly different, you know, and that can be wonderful and also creepy.
That's so interesting that you have various different versions, and one was very like straight and one became very like speculative or experimental.
Yeah.
And my last question is along those lines of, do you find those sort of speculative or supernatural elements through revision, or is it what you're thinking of at the start?
That's such a good question. I think that it usually starts with the speculative, because a lot of the stories just come out of imagining. It's like, you know, like my daughters are always like, Ma, okay, imagine, you know, this is probably a game we all play, and they're just like, there's an alligator in the elevator. What are we going to do? You know, like whatever, stuff like that, you know, and you're like, okay, all right, what's going to happen? You know, and so it kind of starts with that process of, you know, well, what would happen if a story started replicating and dividing on itself. So I think oftentimes with my work, it starts in those speculative questions. And then sometimes I try to rein it in a little bit more, or sometimes just let it run free, you know? So I think it starts in the speculative, although not all of them. Yeah.
Are there any specific instances where you try to rein it in, or is it just dependent on the story? Or
I mean, I always want there to be a reason for the speculative. I really feel like the work that I'm making is I love writing about humans, and so there's a way that I want it to be emotional. There's a way that I want it to connect, even if it's funny, or even if it's a horror tale, or even if it's a work of nonfiction, that I want it to have that element. And so sometimes when it becomes speculative for like entertainment's sake, I think that's when I try to rein it in. If I'm just like, I don't want it to just be strange for the sake of being weird. I want it to still have a human resonance. So yeah, so I would try to rein it in that way.
Yeah, that makes sense. I have one last question, and it's a very open-ended question, just based on reading all of your work. Ghosts and time travel. Thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I feel like the basis of our desire to time travel has to do with our attachment to the dead, right? That we want to get back to see them, or to say that last thing, or whatever it may be. And so, yeah, I connect those two things a lot. I mean, in the last book, in the Unwritten Book, I think I had gotten to a point where I was tired of being so hurt by death. I was tired of feeling so much grief, and trying to think about how I can change that relationship, and have it stop hurting us so much. Gosh darn it. Yeah. Why does death hurt us so much? But that, and to kind of escape from butting my head against the impossibility of like, well, wait, I can't ask him that question, or I can't time travel back to him. As much as I love the romance of that kind of grief, which I do, I love that romance of that kind of grief. And I love humans for how attached we are to our dead. I think I had gotten to a point where I was tired of so much grief. It was during the pandemic, and it was a lot. It was too much death going on in my own family. And so that was part of it. But yeah, there's definitely a connection there. Absolutely. I want to know all those histories that I don't get to know, because, because the histories that we get sometimes are so official, or so cleaned up and so boring. And those are not really the histories that I'm interested in.
All right, I'll open it up to questions from the audience if anyone has anything.
Thanks for all those questions.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for answering them.
Anybody else have a question? Yeah. Here.
I haven't read like your work into Nikola Tesla, but I also came across him like of my own. I think there was a web comic about him or something, but like because he isn't taught in schools, and like so many weird things. I think he also had like a pigeon that he was very much attached to, named.
He was married to her.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And like, yeah. So, but your thing of, what was it, time travel and death?
Yeah.
Like that's I never thought of like that connection. Because like, why would someone want to time travel other than the novelty of it? But it really is like fixing things and like going back to revisit things that are gone. And I just never really like examine it in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. That impossible system has to do with our inability to accept death. Right. Yeah. It's funny when you start thinking about how much our fear and our grief around death start to damage us. And you think about, like James Baldwin is the best writer on this, right? That he links so much violence comes out of the fear of death, or the inability to accept that we are all going to die. And that if we could accept that, then it's like, gets to a point where it's like karaoke. You stand up and you're like, I'm a really bad singer, but love me anyways, right? That's like, then your life becomes that. Once you can accept death, you're like, I'm gonna die, love me anyways, right? That was a strange answer to that. It wasn't really a question, but there we go.
Hi, I'm Allie.
Hey, Allie.
So I was struck while you were reading about how seamlessly I was going in and out of each of the characters' experience, Roy and Susanna.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just from a strategic point of view, like, I was curious about that choice and just going from one person to the other, kind of back and forth like that, instead of staying with one character, or just removing yourself from either of the characters, and how much and what that process is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the only story where I've ever done that, and it's a weird to be. I mean, because you're basically like close third on two different people, right? But there was something about like their isolation, I think, in that neighborhood, and him peeking through the window almost, that allowed me to have that sense. The way that I handled it in the screenplay is maybe revealing too, is that a lot of it is kind of done. I mean, there's a lot of this story that's cheesy that I kind of celebrate its cheesiness, like their kind of pseudo fake romance of like, oh, are we love, like this absurd coupling that happens. And so I actually have them doing each other's voiceovers. But so Suzanne is telling the beginning of the movie as Roy moves through it, but you don't even know who she is yet, and then suddenly there's this moment where she's like, and then he saw me or something, right? So, so I actually switched the knowing in that she's the one telling his story and he's the one telling her story in the film version. But I think I did that because it's almost that close now, right? Like that's the only way I could kind of figure out how to do it, is to have their narrations so entwined that it's almost like one person. Although the fun of that is that, well, I'm not going to tell you what happens at the end, but at the end, there's a great distance between them, right? And there's no, it's like that story's kind of shaped like an X, right? They both start really far away from each other. They come and have this horrible sex moment, whatever it is. And then they end up like that too. Yeah. Structurally thinking of those two voices moving like an X. Hadn't really thought of that before he asked that question, but yeah. Thanks, Sally.
Hi.
Hey there.
So a lot of us in Robert's class read Love Story, which we really liked.
Thanks.
And we also took a class in fragments. And I was just wondering if that story was always planned as a fragment, or do you like writing in fragments?
Yeah. That story is fully like, that was, Ursula K. Le Guin, like the carrier bag of fiction theory. Maybe some of you guys know that, but like just that idea, almost like kitchen sink, or as you as a writer have a bag and you're just like filling it up all day. You're writing down your little ideas, right? That story, okay. So did you guys read the New Yorker version or the dark version? The New Yorker version. Okay. So in the dark version, each of those women that enter her head in the night actually are labeled a hormone. They have a hormone marker. Yeah. And so they come from that idea of like kind of the creepiness, the haunting of how we can be lying in our bodies at night and you almost feel attacked by your hormones sometimes. I mean, you don't even have to be lying there at night. You can be walking down the street. You feel attacked by anger. You feel attacked by frustration, whatever it is. And so each one of those women I kind of thought about separately. Each one of the women who come to her at night are also real people from my life. And so they're very much existed as fragments. They're like, a friend of mine had a mastectomy who liked to go on chat roulette, a friend of mine. I was always like, that's unusual. Okay, I'm gonna take a note of that, just these kind of like vivid moments in life or vivid people that I wanted to include in some way. And so yeah, that piece is very much assembled the same way the Seas was, like that I was just collecting these pieces and then seeing how they go together. And so creating that woman who's bombarded at night by fears seemed like the perfect way to put all of them together into one person's thought, one person's mind. Thanks. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Bronwyn. It was
Bronwyn.
great hearing you read.
Thank you.
I love the dark, and I look forward to reading your other work.
Oh, thanks.
But I wanted to hear a little bit about
just kind of your process, generally speaking, and like how you find your voice. And if, because I liked hearing that 95% of what you do is in revision.
Yeah.
And if when you start something out, you can kind of hear the way you want it to sound, or if that's something that comes in later, once you've kind of found your story and your characters.
I'll say that all the work doesn't come to me the same way. But there's some pieces that come really easily and fast. And those are my favorite pieces because they're easy. And usually the difference between those pieces and the ones that are harder worked is that the voice comes to me immediately, like where you almost feel like someone's talking to you, or you just know the love story. That woman, I was collecting all those bits of it for years, but then suddenly one day she was just like, yeah, I sent my husband away and now I'm scared. And I was like, oh, you don't say, let me, like, tell me more or whatever. And so it just kind of felt like that voice came quickly. Beast from the Dark was like that too. The woman who turns into a deer, that was just like, oh, there's the voice for that person. And then like the story of and the story of those two, that was like a 5-year process. And so that was maybe not as voice driven. I don't know that you can tell the difference between those two, or if there is a difference, but yeah, so I would say the process is really different. One thing that I do process wise is that I'm usually always working on a novel and a story collection at the same time. Which is probably bad. I've started thinking about this the other day. I'm like, it's like I'm driving a snowplow that has way too big a plow on it. And I'm just like trying to be like, I'm like, let me get a smaller snowplow and then I can just push this little story collection forward. But I can't, and I don't know, it's just not the way I work. And part of that has to do with like, just being full of self-doubt, and like I'll look at the novel and I'll be like, that sucks, let's work on this, and then I'll be like, I turn to that short story. And it's not like I'm working on one short story at a time. I'm working on like 4 or 5 too. It's a stupid way to work, but it is the way I work. I mean, the good part of it is like when it's done, it's all done at the same time. And so with my editor, I'll be like, here's a new novel. Oh, and here's 20 new short stories. And she'll be like, wow, okay, thanks a lot. But it takes a lot. It's definitely feels like driving a very heavy snowplow sometimes. But you get to have that nice moment of like when you hate something you're working on, you don't hate everything. You're like, oh, I'll just work on this other one over here. It's good if you don't have a lot of time. Like you have to make your writing time. I have 3 daughters also, and I teach also. So I'm like always having to like make every writing moment count. As we all do. All right. Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
With the process you just described,
Yeah.
where you're working on a novel and then you're working on, maybe several stories at once.
Yeah.
Have you maintained that practice throughout your whole writing life?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I pretty much have. I mean, The Seas, the first book I was writing, that actually felt like I was writing poems.
Mhm.
And then I put them all together. And so that was kind of like both. I could move between the pieces and feel like if I hated one, I'd be like, oh, just work on a different short one. I think Invention of Everything Else was the only book that I actually wrote. Like, I'm just going to sit down and write this book about Tesla. But then I wrote Dark at the same time that I wrote Splitfoot.
Oh.
And then this story collection I wrote while I was writing the Unwritten Book. And now I'm starting a novel at the same time, and I haven't finished this story collection. So yeah, I always have lots of projects going. I'm also making like little short films. I'm way too, there's too many projects going on, but I like it that way.
So yeah, I mean, what I wanted to ask is like, if you've been doing it that way for a while, as you're, changing and as a person in your life, are you, and you're multitasking like that, are you like writing like the same person into all that work
Yeah,
in these different periods? Like,
definitely.
is all the work kind of sort of merging together?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
feel like it is. I mean, I feel like that's kind of an important place to arrive as a writer, is like you find what your question is in life, and there's no shame to spend the rest of your life asking that question. And I mean, for me, the question very much has to do with this idea about, our relationship with the dead. And it's not like I don't think I'm going to answer that question in my lifetime. So I think I'm safe, asking that question again and again in different ways. I think about people who have really a lot more specific questions, like even a writer like, say, like Murakami. I mean, I love his work and I would read any of his books again and again, but every single book is about a woman who goes missing who has some funny ears. And you're like, what? That is so unbelievably specific. And he keeps on writing that same book. And yet I love all of those books. I'm always like, oh, there's her ears. Okay. And they're like, a cat's going to walk through at some point too. You're like, that's amazing. And so, I think that that's an important thing to realize, like you're going to find your question. I mean, it might not be on your first book that you find what your question is, but you're going to find that question. And then it's okay to have all of your work be in conversation. I mean, and hopefully they demonstrate growth in some way, right? Hopefully we get to grow still, even if we keep on asking the same question. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks all of you guys. Thank you for coming and thanks for asking these questions.
Yeah, that's all.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, Sam. But yeah, I think there's now food and drink and all kinds of whatnot. So we're gonna